Hello and welcome to a special episode of Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queer people in history. I'm your host, Hugh Lemmy, and I'm joined today by a guest, Dr. Will Tosh. Will is head of research at Shakespeare's Globe in London and is also the author of a new book called Straight Acting, The Many Queer Lives of William Shakespeare. Hello, Will.
Hello, Hugh. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So before we talk about today's subject, I just want to talk a little bit about your book, actually. In the prologue, you begin by asking the sort of simple question, essentially, was Shakespeare gay or not? But then you answer it very quickly with a sort of yes, probably. So has this been a perennial question for people who have been interested in Shakespeare over the years? And is it something you still get asked about? Or even do you receive pushback for making these claims about him?
Yes to all of those questions, really. So as you know, you and your listeners will, terminology is a sort of vexed issue in history of sexuality. So yes, I say kind of slightly sort of tongue-in-cheekly that like Shakespeare probably was, or certainly was what we would call queer, with that much more capacious term. But I really focus on him being a queer artist in the sense that he is artistically, literarily, intellectually and emotionally really interested in same-sex desire. And he writes about it at length in his plays, but sort of most strikingly in his lyric poetry, in his sonnets, very large number of which are about an impassioned and intimate and kind of sort of crazily intense relationship between a poetic speaker and a beautiful young man. And long before there was terminology around sexual identity, people were getting anxious about the queer content of those sonnets.
Right.
So it really has been a fairly perennial issue, even if the language wasn't the language we would use today. From the middle of the 17th century onwards, readers of the sonnets and hand copyists of the sonnets are kind of reinterpreting them and rewriting them in a more heteronormative way. And there's an editor of the sonnets in 1640 who changes pronouns and gives the sonnets titles that suggest that these sonnets are to a woman. So they might not have used terminology like queer or gay or straight, but they definitely had a kind of reflexive response to what the sonnets were saying.
Yeah, it's one of those things, of course, we use these terms sometimes when we're talking about people who existed before the evolution of these terms of like homosexuality as a provocation. But also when you read Shakespeare, it's unavoidable. He lived in a queer world. The references and things like that, they're so recognizable to us as queer people today as being like, oh yeah, I understand what he's saying here. And in some ways that's the power of his language as well.
Absolutely. And that I think has been, I suppose that's sort of the next step with quite a lot of history of sexuality, isn't it? There's been a long time of being really careful about language and identity and making sort of perhaps a kind of too careful argument about historical difference. And I think that lots of historians and literary critics and artists are now more interested in looking for similarity of feeling and going, how did people who felt like this, like I do, like lots of people do, so how do people who felt like this 400 years ago understand themselves and articulate those feelings?
Yeah.
So I'm not really interested in saying, yeah, Shakespeare was a gay man, 100%.
Yeah.
But like he was occupied with, I'll go so far as to say obsessed with, same-sex desire for men and women. And that comes out in his plays. And I think that's kind of its own answer. It's like, well, that's where his interest lay, or part of his interest lay. And that hasn't really been, that hasn't really been acknowledged in the way that it, I think, should be in things like Shakespeare biographies. People are very careful. They're sort of saying, oh, well, we can't possibly say that he was a homosexual because he wrote these poems. And I kind of think, well, it's not actually, we're not actually in a court of law. And that language is so dated. And so why should it be a kind of forensic proof? It's like he writes about queer desire. That to me is enough to suggest that he's a queer artist wanting to get under the skin of what queer desire is. And that to me is also quite suggestive of where his feelings might have lain.
Yeah, it's very telling when people say he was allegedly homosexual. Allegedly, okay, like it's a crime. Well, of course it was, in a way.
Well, but it wasn't. There was a crime of a certain sexual practice, of sodomy, nothing else was criminal.
Right.
And certainly there was nothing criminal about a feeling or a being.
Yeah.
So that really, so I do push back against that language around, needing to prove that Shakespeare was gay, prove he was queer, alleged homosexual. Like, those feelings are not illegal feelings, even in the 1590s.
Right.
So yeah, that is I would definitely allow more possibility around Shakespeare's sexual identity.
Right. Yeah, what I really enjoyed about the book actually is having sort of posed and then answered this quite obvious question in the prologue that he lives in a recognisably queer world. You actually then use the book to become a sort of, it's partly an emotional biography of Shakespeare and his private life and his intimate relationships, but also uses his life and especially his work to ask these much broader questions about Elizabethan England, and especially about how they understood their own sex-gender system at the time. And so Shakespeare was born, a few years into the reign of Elizabeth I, and he died about a decade afterwards, something like that?
That's right, yeah. So he's born in 1564, so that's, 6 years after Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne.
And dies in the reign of James.
That's right, 1616.
Another recognisably fruity character.
Another recognizable. Well, I mean, as you will know, as you've shown, an evil and complicated queen in history.
Or queen, yeah.
Or queen.
So, I guess my question is, how do you think that a young man who was born at that time would have sort of recognized those desires, through law, as you mentioned, but also through wider sort of social recognition? And then something that I thought was very interesting in your book is you talk about his education at grammar school and how in grammar school he would have been, because of the sort of renewed interest in the classics, in Latin and Greek texts that was emerging, had been emerging throughout the Renaissance, was sort of at its height in this new education system at the time. He would have been encountering homosexuality or same-sex desire, let's say, and also gender divergence at that time. How did that clash with sort of, I don't know, let's say a more man-on-the-street view of homosexuality or same-sex desire?
So this is such a great question, and also a really difficult question to answer, because that is asking the historical record and asking art and literature to give a kind of really clear sense of a sensibility, a feeling, a culture. I am, for all the sort of slightly kind of primary colour optimism of some of my book, I am not by any means suggesting this was some sort of queer utopia where people who had same-sex desires were out and proud and living their best life. It was not, and I don't think anyone would believe me if I tried to say that it was. But what I am trying to suggest is that although the sort of quite rigid definitional boundaries and identity boundaries lots of us live within today, not all of us, but lots of us do, weren't really a thing in the 1590s and 1600s. So people didn't think about being a gay man. There were, I suppose you could call them, different discourses and contexts for queer desire. So there was sex of all sorts, and sex, some of which sat at the point of criminality. So sodomy is a crime. Men cannot have, or women cannot have anal sex. It's against the law. With people, with animals, all the same law. It's wrong, and it's punished by death. It's a really serious crime. But it's also really hard to prosecute that crime because it requires two witnesses ideally, of penile penetration of an anus and emission of semen. So you're not likely to find many occasions when that is witnessed to a kind of juridical degree. It just doesn't get prosecuted. So there are sort of handfuls of sodomy prosecutions across the country for most of the reign. It's a really, really small number. So to all intents and purposes, people are not walking around with a great kind of sort of chip of anxiety on their shoulder that the things they do and feel are going to land them in prison. They don't see that as a realistic prospect. Yes, there are other social and religious forces that are clamping down on how people behave, and those are ecclesiastical courts and just general busybody observation. But they're doing that for everyone, for every kind of sexuality, outside of the most vanilla reproductive sex that happens,
man and wife
once a month kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the church says, unless you're having sex expressly to have a baby, you are committing fornication. So basically everyone is fornicating all the time if they're having an active sex life of any description. So they're all committing sins. Where that sin verges into, yeah, but what about the hand job, or what about the mutual masturbation, or the lying next to the guy you really like, and the this and the that. That is such a hard thing to say. And I also think in the past we've been really doctrinaire about like, well, yes, with the sodomy rates are this and they're that. And I'm like, there's a lot of other things people could be doing.
Yeah.
And it's also perfectly possible to have a sexuality and a sexual identity and not have sex. and have intimate connections that are not sexual, that are still eroticized and are still romantic. So there's all of that is really hard to recover for obvious reasons. But where you do find evidence of those sorts of connections are in imaginative literature, in poetry, in the practical lived experience of men and women who live outside of marriage, quite sex segregated lives. So there's not a lot of huge amounts of social blending between the genders, who, particularly as young people, share beds with unrelated friends, colleagues, work people of the same sex, who are encouraged by partly the precedent of classical literature to have really ardent feelings about their friends, using this sort of idealizing language of ideal friendship, and also told, all the time by the church that, fornicating with women will, wind you up in hell. It's more of a kind of logical conclusion where you go, well, look, that's probably where queer culture is existing, is in that realm of intimate homosocial life that will tip over for certain people at certain times into an erotic life.
Yeah.
And so when you then see, for example, the theatrical culture that of single sex commercial theatre companies that Shakespeare works in, playing with that idea that queer desire is something there and current and touchable and tangible, that's because it is. That's because people do know what those feelings are.
Right. Yeah. And some of the classical references are sort of just building on that lived experience in the first place, right?
Exactly. And of course, early modern England doesn't have a sort of institutionalized queer culture, kind of pederastic culture like ancient Greece and also ancient Rome to an extent. It doesn't have that in the same public way, but it certainly knows about it. And actually, although it's more of a kind of subculture and sort of under the radar, there is a kind of rather classical age hierarchized queer sexual culture where boys, adolescents, younger men are understood as in the sexual purview of men.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why boys, adolescents, young men playing women is seen as completely intellectually and erotically coherent. Because it's like, well, yeah, because they're kind of in the same category.
Yeah, because men were expected to have some sort of erotic desires towards younger boys. So they can. It's not quote unquote weird to the audience if the beautiful young woman who's the love interest in the play is eroticized. There's no conflict there at all for the viewers because they're used to eroticizing younger boys.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And although the aim certainly in theatre broadly is to create a kind of convincing performance of femininity, it is a layered one and a kind of self-ironizing one, because everyone's in the know. There's a knowledge that's what's being kind of activated or wielded on stage is a sort of dual erotic energy of both the boy and the female character.
Interesting. It's a little bit kinky.
It's all very kinky.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I really loved about the book, which I really enjoyed the book, because it's both very readable and accessible for someone like me without that academic background, but it's also like unashamedly intelligent, and it really wants to talk about some of those more complex ideas. But it's that you look at those wider issues with sex and gender at a time in early modern England, like I said, not just through its legal history, but through this literary analysis at how Shakespeare, but also his contemporaries, like the other poets and playwrights, were talking about sex and also, as you mentioned, gender and the intersection of the two things. And so today I think we're going to talk about one of his contemporaries, someone who's probably less well known but has been really deeply influential for for queer writers and theatre practitioners through the ages. So, yeah, who's today's bad gay?
So today's bad gay is the playwright and poet Christopher Marlowe.
Excellent. I have actually been wanting to do Christopher Marlowe for ages because it's kind of an interesting swashbuckling story, no?
It is. Although I'm kind of a Marlowe fan, so we might have to have a debate over whether he's a bad gay or not.
Fine. That's what we're here for.
Excellent. So yes, Hugh, thank you so much. Today's bad gay is Christopher Marlowe. He is in many ways he's sort of Shakespeare's more dramatic twin. They're more or less exactly the same age. Shakespeare's born in April 1564. Marlowe is born in February of the same year, February 1564. And he's born into really quite a similar social class as Shakespeare, into provincial trades towns. Marlowe is born in Canterbury town, the ancient cathedral town of Canterbury in Kent. His dad is a shoemaker, kind of general man of business. And it's a very Kentish family with these long roots. Like Shakespeare, he goes to a grammar school, really good grammar school. Unlike Shakespeare, he goes to university, receives a BA from Cambridge University, also studies for an MA with an advanced degree, real intellectual. And like Shakespeare, comes to London, gets involved in the theatre industry, very soon makes an enormous mark on the stage with a massively successful first play called Tamburlaine the Great. It's a sprawling, swashbuckling, mad adventure about a Central Asian conqueror, which is so popular it spawns a sequel, and that really makes his name. And within 5-6 years, he has sort of straddled the theatre world. He's become the leading dramatist, leading playwright for a really successful company. He turns out history plays, he turns out plays about classical themes, he turns out sort of a kind of terrifying moral tragedies. He's doing everything. And we'll get into like more detail about what those plays mean for his legacy. But I suppose one of the things that keeps Marlowe really alive in people's imaginations is the sort of other profession, I suppose, people ascribe to him through his years as a dramatist, which is working in, seems to be government service of some sort, what seems to be some kind of what people like to call espionage activities. He's doing stuff with government servants who have an interest in what is going on in flashpoints of Europe, like France and the Netherlands. We're going to circle back a little bit to think about how Marlowe gets involved in those circles, but we're going to fast forward to his final days, I suppose his final weeks, which have also sealed his reputation as someone with an incredibly dramatic reputation and someone whose life was lived at a really intense pitch. Marlowe dies in the very end of May 1593, and he dies violently. He is stabbed allegedly through the eye in a house in a house in Deptford, to the southeast of London.
And how old is he?
He is. This is asking me to do math. He is 20. He's just turned 29.
Just turned 29. So
he is young.
Yeah, like a real burst of energy and a sort of a firecracker life.
Absolutely. His 20s are like epically productive, and then it all ends. He's stabbed. So he is stabbed at the tail end of a series of really awkward events for Marlowe. So it's spring 1593, about April time. This is a really bad period for being in London and generally being in England. It's not a nice time. There's been a very virulent outbreak of plague in London and elsewhere through 1592 into 1590, which means theatres have been shut, places of entertainment have been shut. People have left London. They're staying at home. It's all very lockdowny.
So his livelihood is at risk.
His livelihood is at risk. Bad harvest, so food prices are really high. General kind of air of grimness and unhappiness, and a sort of fractious, scratchy London starts to do what scratchy Londoners sadly often do, which is look for scapegoats and turn on the other. And there's a real unpleasant uptick in anti-immigrant sentiment and aggression. This is expressed in April 1593 by the appearance around London, several of them, of what are known as anti-alien libels. So handwritten screeds, or kind of sort of a bit like a kind of like really intemperate Twitter post written out and stuck on a wall, saying horrible things about mostly French and Dutch immigrants and some Italian immigrants. And this is not great. This isn't typical London behaviour. The authorities aren't very pleased. They're kind of trying to find out who's responsible for it. On the 5th of May, the most violent of these libels gets stuck on the wall of the Dutch church. So the Dutch Protestant church set up by immigrants from the Low Countries in London. And this is again one of these sort of angry sort of rants about foreigners taking jobs, and it ends with a threat. It ends with a threat to kill the immigrant, and the writer of this screed says, "We'll cut your throat in your temples praying, not Paris massacre so much did spill." And that's a reference to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France in the 1570s, when Catholic forces turned on French Protestants and murdered them.
The Huguenots,
right? But it's the Huguenots, exactly. But it's also a reference to a play of that name by Marlowe.
Oh, wow.
And there are other echoes of Marlowe's work in that libel, and the libel is signed Tamburlaine.
Oh, wow. So his work was so well known that people could sort of use it in references in wider political things, and it'd be read like that? Exactly.
Now, it is clearly the case that the authorities picked up on that because they close in on Marlowe. But that's obviously like an awful thing for a writer to have their work taken and sort of used in this sort of violent and aggressive way. There is basically 0% chance that Marlowe wrote it. He didn't write it. He didn't. He wasn't involved in it. But they're taking his words.
And are they taking his words because his words were powerful and they knew they would resonate with people who understood his plays, or are they actually trying to impersonate him and suggest that this great playwright is also anti-alien, anti-immigrant?
No, I think it's the former. I think they're taking his words because he has a reputation for crafting characters who seize their destiny, do stuff, takes direct, drastic action, march around kind of getting what they want, often by killing people.
Right.
So he sort of has that. He has that as a kind of brand, and that is the appropriate brand for these intemperate people putting this libel together. The authorities start circling. They arrest Marlowe's former roommate, who is another playwright called Thomas Kidd, ransack their room, or rather Kidd's room, and find some actually quite innocuous theological document that they decide is really heretical. So arrest Kidd, they torture him, and he eventually he doesn't really spill on Marlowe, but later on when Kidd puts his responses in writing, it's after Marlowe's death by this point, and he just says Marlowe is just and irresponsible and intemperate and just a terrible man. So Kidd just sort of lays blame on Marlowe. But what's interesting is the government authorities, the Privy Council, don't go and arrest Marlowe straight away. I don't think they really think he's responsible for the libels. Mm-hmm. I think they're just like, they need to get him in to talk to him. They summon him for a meeting and a kind of a sort of investigation at the end of May. He finally speaks to the Privy Council on the 20th of May. So it's not a very urgent thing. But that horrible libel gets posted up on the 5th of May. They bring in Kidd a week later. Nearly a week after that, they bring in Marlowe. And then a few days after they talk to Marlowe on the 20th of May, sorry, this is getting very like cold case murder investigation, but we're going to kind of go through the evidence. There is this letter that gets sent to the Privy Council on the 26th of May by a guy called Richard Baines, and it's sort of a poison pen letter. Like he writes in a letter saying, here's some stuff you ought to know about Christopher Marlowe. And among the things that he says about Christopher Marlowe, it's a sort of mix of atheistical, irreligious sentiments and sort of his own sort of view of life and fairly disrespectful things about kind of, the English state. So Baines in this note says that Marlowe alleges that Christ was a bastard and his mother dishonest.
Wow.
And yeah, right.
And this is sort of a high point of religious tension. This is like, in the middle of the Reformation, English Reformation.
So this is 1590s. We're still kind of like hovering. It's a war with Spain, Catholic Spain. Mm-hmm. Still all sorts of religious uncertainties, and it is not okay to be saying that. I mean, it's not okay to be saying that anywhere in Europe at this point, but definitely not in England. And there are lots more of these sorts of sentiments that are anti-religion and also quite shocking in lots of other ways. So he also says that St. John the Evangelist was bedfellow to Christ and leant always in his bosom. He used him as the sinners of Sodoma.
Way.
So there we go. And a bunch of other sort of things about religion, and also this line that is really attached itself to Marlowe, that Marlowe says, "They that love not tobacco and boys were fools."
And to what degree do you reckon this is an accurate reflection of some of Marlowe's beliefs?
So this is the really interesting question, because Richard Baines himself it's probably someone who Marlowe had, I don't know if he met him, but he certainly crossed paths with him a few months before, about a year before, in Flushing in the Netherlands, where Marlowe had gone. We don't quite know why, but he'd gone to the Netherlands, probably on some kind of courier mission. And while there, he, really stupidly, gets involved in coin counterfeiting and is sent back from Flushing, sort of in disgrace. And Richard Baines is named in that incident as well. So Baines had been there. Baines had also probably, same individual who gets involved in English Catholic circles in Europe, potentially as a spy, potentially as a plant, slightly unclear. But he's quite dodge. And he clearly has beef with Marlowe, evidently. Why else would you send in this letter?
Right, yeah.
It's probably a mixture of stuff Marlowe has said and stuff that is impossible to disprove. And believable enough, given Marlowe's other kind of known attributes and beliefs, to land quite well as an attempted sort of slander or smear. So Marlowe definitely did have quite advanced religious beliefs. He definitely sort of fancied himself as a radical, a free thinker. The term atheist doesn't mean doesn't believe in God, just means has questions about established doctrine. And that, I think that's right for Marlowe. I think he was like that. And others of his colleagues and friends do say that. They say, he's this sort of atheistical figure.
So maybe a forerunner of some of the religious beliefs that would emerge in English Civil War afterwards. Like a lot of those ideas that were emerging then were already in the culture.
Oh yeah,
100 years earlier.
Totally. And even a bit later, even the beginnings of a kind of Enlightenment rationalism. Yeah, I think that's sort of that's. Well, as a real intellectual, he's really done his thinking. So I think there is an element of that. And that tobacco and boys thing, it's kind of it's got a swagger to it, hasn't it? That line. And I think again, that's a plausible thing for him to have said. Maybe especially a Marlowe in his cups. Kind of. I can see that, but I also have many questions about the Baines note and about what it's trying to do and about the context and intention of the things that Marlowe allegedly said. So anyway, that note gets filed into the Privy Council in Tray on the 26th of May. We don't really know how it's received other than it gets copied, which is why we still have the notes. And it clearly is kind of processed by the civil servants of the Privy Council. 4 days after that, on the 30th of May, Marlowe, who is, not in prison, not being kept anywhere, gets invited to what is referred to as a feast by someone called Ingram Fraser, who is the servant of Marlowe's patron, Sir Thomas Walsingham. And he goes along to this house in Deptford, which isn't a tavern, it's not a pub, it's like a sort of high class, I guess we'd call it nowadays, like a restaurant, but they don't use that term. It's even more than that. It's sort of like a kind of country club. Like they go there in the morning, about 10 o'clock in the morning, they dine, people dine early in the 1590s. They dine, they take a walk in the garden, they hang around, they do whatever they do in the house, and they have another meal. They have their supper at 6 o'clock. And then there's more hanging around. So they've been there the entire day. They've been hanging around the entire day.
Drinking?
Yeah, evidently drinking.
Day drinking.
So then late day drinking, always day. And indeed ends quite badly for Marlowe, as we will discover.
I've spent some days day drinking in Deptford, and it never ends well.
It never. I suspect it ends less badly for you than it did for Marlowe.
You'd be surprised.
The end of the day, and all of this information comes from a coroner's report that is filed a few days after a short time after the killing. So they're inside. They're in a parlour of some sort in the house. Marlowe, Fraser, and two other guys called Nicholas Skeers and Robert Pooley. There seems to be some kind of dispute or quarrel, possibly over, well, the coroner says it's over the reckoning or the bill. Whether that's over who should pay what or what the bill says, or whether there should be a bill at all. Like if Marlowe's been invited to a party by someone and then presented with his anyway. Marlowe apparently gets up. He's been lying down on a bed or a day bed or a sofa. Not they had sofas, but some kind of furniture structure. He gets up and he grabs Fraser's dagger from his belt, his scabbard, Fraser's own dagger, and hits him with it. And he probably uses the hilt of the dagger, causes a injury, fairly superficial injury. Fraser then kind of goes for the knife and tries to get it back, and there's a fracas and a struggle, and the knife gets sunk into Marlowe's eye, and he dies.
And this is the official coroner's report.
That's the official coroner's report, which it is based on evidently the testimony of Ingram Fraser and Nicholas Skeers and Robert Pooley. So, by all means, that report is evidently open to question in terms of what actually happened. But the sort of violence and shock of that has also fed quite a lot of sort of exciting John le Carré / conspiracy theorist stuff about who those men were. Again, very good questions. What Marlowe was doing there, whether this is a kind of state-sponsored assassination or whether it's just young guys drinking all day, getting into a fight and it being an accident, which is also 100% possible.
100% believable, but then that's exactly why it would be a good cover story.
Well, that's exactly why it would be a cover story. So to Marlowe's rep, actually Marlowe's rep gets quite kind of excitable quite quickly. So really within only a few years after his death, he gets written up in slightly sort of tabloidy, moralistic publications about people who came to a sticky end, kind of consequence of his irreligious, quarrelsome life. Not to do with queerness. And in fact, some of the stories get embellished that he and Fraser are fighting over the same woman or something. So but it's to do with him being quarreler, to do with being violent, to being a sort of scurrilous, bad lad, playmaker, poet, wild boy who got what he was, got what was coming to him.
A little bit like Sid Vicious or something.
Completely. And that initially that reputation was driven by quite kind of moralizing writers who used him as an example for others. Don't be like him, live virtuously. And then from the 19th century onwards, much more kind of romantically and intoxicatingly as this sort of shadowy spy figure who, served the Queen and kind of in various sorts of foreign missions while writing these amazing plays and living this kind of wild, intellectually ambitious, religiously questioning life, and also has these sentiments and views about queer desire, which earlier on were sort of like deliciously outrageous and shocking, and later on more recently have become real symbols of a kind of queer figure from history, someone we really want to think about what those queer desires meant. And one of the things I do in my book is use Marlowe as an example of someone who is also exploring his society's understanding of queer desire through his work. So, yeah, I think the Baines note and the stuff about tobacco and boys, on the balance of probability, probably is true in a way, but also it's really crap evidence historically because of all the problems around it. What for me is more interesting and more useful is to look at what he does in his work, where I think there's a much more thoroughgoing exploration of early modern queer desire that does mark Marlowe out as someone, even more than Shakespeare, being really artistically and intellectually committed to exploring that in his work. And I would land on two plays by Marlowe that I think are, certainly more explicit than some of lots of Shakespeare's work about an interest in nameable queer desire. And that's his historical drama, his historical tragedy, Edward II, and an early play that's very little performed nowadays, but has a fascinating opening scene called Dido, Queen of Carthage. And I'll just talk briefly about Edward II.
Edward II was definitely the first I encountered, I think, in Marlowe, because Brecht did a sort of version of it in the early 20th century, right?
That's right. And did he Derek Jarman much later on?
Two of my theatrical heroes.
Well, and it's a wonderful play. It's a really wonderful play. So Marlowe's writing Edward II, same sort of time that Shakespeare's writing his early history plays, and he's using the same kind of sources. He's using these big narrative compilations of English history that give great long accounts of reigns, going through every kind of battle and every sort of change of advisor and every just like endless.
So this is what both Shakespeare and him did, which was to go back through these chronicles and sort of mine them for good stories, really.
Mine them for exactly right. And what you see Marlowe doing with the Edward II story is go back to the sources, to Holinshed's Chronicles and other sources, and go, Edward, king, his favourite, Piers Gaveston, and the turmoil that relationship causes, and latch onto that as his subject. And in fact, Gaveston dies only a few years into Edward's reign, and Edward has quite a long reign, 20-year reign.
Yeah, for listeners who are interested, actually, in one of our earlier episodes, we did an episode on Gaveston and that whole history, his relationship with Edward II. It's a fascinating and sort of gory, gruesome story.
It's absolutely fascinating. So I won't go into too much detail. Listeners must go and look up that episode as well. What Marlowe clearly chooses to do is focus on that as the most dramatically interesting thing in Edward's reign, even though that isn't historically the dominating incident or series of incidents in it. That's what that's what Marlowe really chooses to focus on. And I suggest in the book that he's doing that partly because there are sort of parallel concerns around kings and their favourites in Scotland at this time with James, who is James VI, not yet James I. James VI of Scotland, where his favourites are causing all sorts of turmoil, and also Henri III in France. In the middle of the French Wars of Religion, Henri III, who is this young king, one of several siblings who sit on the throne, who is surrounded by kind of elegant, sort of dainty, rather effeminate minions, they're called. Mignons, the king's minions. And both in Scotland and in France, there are publications about sort of the problem of this and the danger of it. And in fact, in France, they even go so far as to compare King Henri III and his chief minion to Edward and Gaveston. So there's a sort of sense in which the Edward Gaveston story is kind of in the air. And if Marlowe was someone, as it seems very likely, who had kind of cross-channel connections, he's doing some of this sort of couriering work, he may have access to some of those sort of intellectual, those sort of discussions that are going on in France. And that may be feeding into his conception of why Edward and Gaveston is an interesting story.
And also because, I guess, there's a sort of sensation, or a sense at the time, both with James and Henry, but this idea of having favourites is suspiciously, and having queer favourites is suspiciously Catholic behaviour, right?
Oh, well, that's really interesting. I suppose there is an anxiety about that. But funnily enough, I think one of the things that makes Edward II so fabulous and as a play and has really ensured its survival is that the play is not categorical about royal favoritism and indeed royal queer desire. There are characters, even in Edward II, who are against Edward, who utter quite ambivalent and even sort of mildly supportive thoughts about kings and minions. And offer historical precedent for other kings who have had their minions and it's been fine.
And so is this something that would be recognisable to a theatre-goer audience as like a comment on political things? The political
I don't know.
It still happens today, right? Like I remember when Shakespeare, when Trump was elected, I think in Central Park there was a sort of performance of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. We're making very heavy reference towards Trump. And it's sort of read as, it was explicitly read as that by the audience, and a lot of people got very upset about it, obviously because he dies at the end.
Right, and that particular production at Shakespeare in the Park was really overt about making Caesar look like Trump. And I think with the sort of stuff that Marlowe might be being influenced by and informed by, I don't think it's really as clear as that example in New York. But I do think it's tapping into existing thoughts, anxieties, questions about intimate relationships, and particularly royal ones. And the great thing about Edward II is that it shows Marlowe really asking questions about what an intimate male relationship looks like for a king. Because a king having a kind of shared soul intimacy with another man, which is what King Edward says about Gaveston, is sort of problematic, given that a king is a symbol of the country, the crowned head, anointed by God. You can't give away your soul like that. It's not allowed. If a crowned queen is in love with a man and marries him and he becomes king, he is higher than her.
Mm-hmm.
If a king marries a woman and marries her and makes her his queen, that's okay, because the man is still on top in the social structure. A king in love with a man, giving away half of his soul, what do you do? That creates real political problems.
There's no constitutional framework for that.
There's no constitutional framework for it. And the play is really interested in pitting Gaveston against Edward's wife, Isabella, who really acknowledges, really sees the reality of what's going on, is really absolutely sees Gaveston as an emotional and political threat. And she characterizes herself as the goddess Juno. And that's a bit of a giveaway name, because Juno is the wife of Jupiter, and Jupiter takes up the boy Ganymede to be his cupbearer and lover, and pisses off Juno. And Juno famously gets angry about it, and it's one of the causes of the Trojan War. So really what Marlowe's doing is taking this idea that intimate, passionate friendship with your soulmate is a good thing until it's a bad thing. And here the bad reason is that Edward is a king and can't give away half of his soul. The play is much less sure and much less emphatic about whether it's a bad thing because that relationship is eroticized.
Right.
Partly because the play isn't 100% clear about it, but also it's also quite hard to miss in the paralleling of Gaveston and Isabella, in the intimacy and closeness of the men, in the way in which they are known as taking great delight in the male body and in the sorts of things that are kind of indexing queer desire. So the play doesn't end well for Edward, doesn't end well for Gaveston either, who is killed halfway through. But Edward is not presented as a villain, and he's not presented as wildly less competent or capable than anyone else in his world, or than any other sort of, lots of other kings and rulers. He makes mistakes. He's not the best king in the world, but that central relationship with Gaveston is unstable and problematic for lots of reasons. But in terms of the queerness of that connection, Marlowe really pulls back from allowing the play to blame Edward for those desires.
What's interesting here is that there's a political commentary going on about, contemporary rulers at that time. But at the same time, he's also clearly been driven here by the sort of dramatic needs of the plot and what he's developing, this tension that it doesn't necessarily resolve, and it isn't quite clear, that it leaves an ambiguity around it, is actually the thing that makes the play so compelling.
And it's the thing that really changes in lots of ways the way historical storytelling gets produced on stage. Marlowe is really innovative in terms of turning this into an emotional tragedy. Like, it's not just, what's that line about history, one damn thing after another? Yeah. That's not his structure. That's not his dramaturgy. He shapes that play around this contrastive, compelling, difficult to manage relationship. Edward loves Gaveston. He also loves being a king. He can't be both.
Yeah. And what's interesting in your book, in the chapter where you talk about the influence of this play, is the effect it had on Shakespeare. That it was just before Shakespeare started writing a sort of new cycle of history plays, and it was taking that tension of the split between kingly duty and personal desire that was then so influential in Shakespeare's later work, right?
Absolutely. And you see, it's the connections between Marlowe's Edward II and Shakespeare's Richard II are really apparent and have been noticed for a very long time. It's clear that Shakespeare was really influenced by what Marlowe does with Edward II. The broad arc of Shakespeare's Richard II is sort of the same. It is a king who gets into real trouble with his barons, does things that infuriate them. They kind of overpower him, and he's presented as a sort of ineffectual, rather effeminate king. Then they lock him away in a castle, and that's the Edward arc. So I think Shakespeare's completely just sort of taking what Edward II is doing and kind of working it in a new way. But I do think that sense of that Marlowe has innovated a way of telling historical stories which are also emotional dramas and tragedies, which is, he wasn't the first person. Shakespeare does that with his Henry VI plays and with Richard III. But the tautness that Marlowe creates in Edward II is I think new and is hugely inspirational for Shakespeare. And you see that again as well in the Henry IV plays and Henry V, with this idea of a king prince kind of torn in different directions. I think Shakespeare gets those stories from Holinshed, from the same place as Marlowe, but it's Marlowe kind of helping to show Shakespeare how to shape the story.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Were they friends? Did they hang out? Or did they just know each other's work?
They know each other's work. But Shakespeare, in fact, sort of places a sort of acknowledgement, really, of some years after his death in the play As You Like It, where he has one of the characters, a countrywoman, reflect in a kind of romantic and poetic moment. She says, "Ah, dead shepherd, now I see thy sort of might. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight," which is a quote from Marlowe. And dead shepherd is dead poet. So it's a delicate, rather sweet reference that Shakespeare puts in some years after his death.
Yeah, using his own words.
We don't know if they met. I'm sure they did. Like, they're in the same industry. In fact, their worlds also overlap in terms of theatre companies. So at various points there, you can find their work in the same theatre company. So we can't put them on the same page historically, but I think it's really unlikely that they didn't meet and didn't know each other.
How big was the theatre world in London in the
really not
1600s? Did they ever write the same stories?
They didn't, no. It's a great question. I suppose in a sense I would say that, the closest they get is Edward and Richard II. Where it's different king, different source material, but they're kind of working the same play, aren't they? I mean, they are kind of going over similar ground. And so the other play I just wanted to mention for listeners who might not know all of Marlowe's work was what might be his first play. It's a play called Dido, Queen of Carthage, which is based on the story of the ancient queen who has a relationship with the Trojan refugee Aeneas before he goes off to found Rome. It's a famous love story. The gods make them fall in love, and it's all sort of torturous and kind of painful. And Aeneas leaves, and Queen Dido is so distraught that she commits suicide, and she's the sort of absolute kind of archetype for the tragic dramatic heroine. Now Marlowe writes a version of this story for a London theatre company that is composed entirely of boys. And this was a theatrical fashion at the time. You have mostly choristers who are also actors, ranging in age from about 8 up to sort of 14, 15 kind of age, putting on dramas, full-length dramas, wildly popular, very kind of courtly and rather elite. It's a much sort of social higher end kind of offering than the big playhouses like the Theatre or the Rose or later on the Globe. So in Dido, Queen of Carthage, formed by these boys, there is this astonishing opening scene. So obviously it's set in classical times and gods, and the first scene takes place on Mount Olympus, and there is an opening stage direction that kind of stops you in your tracks. The opening stage direction to Dido, Queen of Carthage runs, "Here the curtains draw. There is discovered Jupiter, dandling Ganymede upon his knee, and Mercury lying asleep."
Oh, wow.
So Jupiter and Ganymede, the kind of archetypal story of older man, younger boy sexual plaything, widely understood as implying that and meaning that at the time. That's the scene that Marlowe opens this play with. And it's made really clear what they're doing. The first line in the play, it's Jupiter saying, "Come, gentle Ganymede, and play with me. I love thee well, say Juno what she will." Really putting viewers right in that world where Ganymede is the sexual competition to Juno. Juno is rendered very cross by it, and Jupiter, because he's a god, doesn't care. And we've seen in Edward II, Isabella compare herself to Juno, outraged, abandoned wife in the face of competition from this younger male lover. And Marlowe here in this earlier play is staging that scene of seduction. And as that little scene goes on, it's quite a short opening scene. Ganymede says, "Okay, fine, I'll play with you. I'll hug you and kiss you, but I want some jewelry. And I want you to tell Juno to stop knocking me around the head." And Jupiter's like, yes, whatever you want. I just, it's this scene of queer sexual foreplay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's the first time Ganymede is brought onto the English stage, and certainly the first time that scene is played. And that might even be Marlowe's first play. So if so, he really is like lifting the curtain on his theatrical career with this scene of queer seduction. And that,
which would
for
have been
me,
shocking.
I think it would have been massively shocking. Yeah.
But what relationship does that scene play? Is it sort of an allegory for what's going to come later in the play, if the play is about Dido and Aeneas?
It functions allegorically because you're given a kind of a vision of two people who give themselves over to passion, whereas in fact at the end of the play Aeneas will, very nobly say, no, I can't stay with Dido. I must go and found Rome. So it sort of leaves. But it's also not just allegorical because Aeneas's mother is the goddess Venus. So Venus then shortly after the dandling comes in and berates Jupiter for hanging out playing with Ganymede while her son Aeneas is sailing away from Troy and possibly, about to wreck himself on rocks or something.
Yeah.
So it is both a sort of heavenly allegory, but also just like they're part of the plot because Venus is concerned about her son.
And really also this thing of this queer desire being the thing that distracts people from their proper moral duty and political duty. Yes. And that, our earlier discussion about sort of where queer desire sits at this time,
it sits in a sort of panoply of things humans do which they shouldn't. I think for lots of people, it's stuff that takes you away from your duties. It's stuff that draws you to indulge your desires and passions. It's like, lying around in bed all day, or reading novels, or drinking too much. It's a sort of humane foible.
But it's amazing how universal it is in terms of history, and like in terms of like a depiction of queer desire, that the great person who is distracted from their greatness and fulfilling their historical task by boys. It's a story of Oscar Wilde feasting with panthers, and we all know these people in our own lives as well, I think.
Absolutely. And who's to say their great task is not hanging out with boys?
Right, and it's also an escape from these obligations that they probably want to avoid, that come with being regarded as great. Yeah. Do you think when the audience, you said it would have been massively shocking? I'm trying to get a picture in my mind of what this sort of audience would have been if it's being produced for not the sort of rough and ready popular playhouses, but for this other audience. Are they shocked in a sort of, I'm trying to think of like a modern version of it today. When like the Daily Mail does an expose on like Northern girls going out on New Year's Eve, and it's appalled by young women today because they all go out in miniskirts and strappy tops, and then just to make sure their readers know how appalled they are, there has like 50 different photographs of these girls doing it. There's a sort of prurient thing where they're like shocked but they're also into it, or is it a more real shock where they're like, wow, this is disgusting, or is it a shock where they're not quite so moralistic about it, they're just not used to seeing it depicted, of being like, wow, this is brave, bold stuff from an enfant terrible in the theatre world?
Well, look, I would my sort of hunch would be the latter, the final option. It's shocking because it's bold. It's not shocking because it's unfamiliar, because Marlowe's lifting this from classical myth. It's a story that's familiar. It's a story that's not necessarily always staged with live bodies, which may be a kind of novelty, but the actual nature of the story is part and parcel of European myth and literature. So, and I think that
so it's a story people know, but they're not used to it being depicted so graphically. It's a bit like Pasolini's Sarlo or 120 Days of Sodom. It's like this story is hundreds of years old. We all know the story of Sarda's Sodom, but then to see it actually represented so graphically at the time was appalling.
Yes, and I don't think it was appalling for early watchers, early audience members of Dido, Queen of Carthage. I think it was avant-garde and thrilling and shocking because it's new. It's really interesting to try and kind of dig into audience makeup about indoor theatres like the one that first staged Dido, Queen of Carthage, versus theatres like the Rose or the Theatre or the Globe, which was built in 1599. Lots of work has been done trying to kind of demographically build up who those people were, not always hugely successfully or clearly. There has been some really interesting work on other all-boy playhouses a bit later on into the sort of 1600s, with a suggestion by a historian called Mary Bly, that one of the later playhouses, the Whitefriars, did actually consciously develop a kind of queer and queer-coded repertory that sort of really, really lent into plays, not, in fact, plays by Marlowe or Dido, Queen of Carthage, but plays that drew on the erotic comedy or the wit of, for example, female characters dressing up as boys for plot reasons, who, of course, are played by boys. So you get that kind of double irony and lots of other sorts of slightly kind of sexy jokes about sort of codpieces. And her suggestion is that, again, terminology aside, notion of kind of identity formation sort of aside, there's a sign here that there is a recognition of a potential market, a potential community of theatre goers who might like the same things or kind of get turned on by the same things, who enjoy being part of that community of theatre consumers, which I think is quite persuasive. And I think there's probably something to be said for thinking about, I think probably particularly the boy company playhouses, as places that, if we're going to look for a queer subculture, which queer culture, it's not really sub, but queer culture in Shakespeare's London, one of the places we might want to think about is certainly the Playhouse and those sorts of theatres in particular.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, I feel like I could talk to you all day about these things. It's such an interesting subject, and there's so many plays I want to go away and watch now. I've never seen Tamburlaine. You're listening to Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queer people in history. And we'd just like to take a moment to thank all our supporters over on Patreon.
Yeah, it wouldn't be possible without you. And that's why we now have, for Patreon supporters and Apple Podcast subscribers, a new monthly podcast called Extra Bad Gays. And that's where we have more informal but still informed conversations about hot topics, current issues, current events, current culture, but we do it with that same analysis that makes the show. So this last month, we just talked about this new gay Fire Island nightmare community that they want to build in the Mediterranean. But it ended up becoming a much deeper conversation about the history of gentrification, about gay men's complicity in it, about how it affects queer communities. And that's the kind of analysis you can expect from the show, along with, episodes about Diva Down George Santos and our favorite and least favorite gay Christmas movies.
And if you still feel like you haven't had your fill of Bad Gays, why not check out our book, which is available now, Bad Gays: A Homosexual History, in hardback or paperback. And it's also now available in Italian translation and coming soon in Thai and in Spanish.
And that's at badgayspod.com/book. And our Patreon is patreon.com/badgayspod, or click subscribe in Apple Podcasts. Back to the show.
Thanks, Will. That's a fascinating story and a really, really interesting life. So this is very much my pet subject, but you mentioned it early on, and I'd just like to go back to it because I'm kind of interested in it. You talked about his sort of relationship with the state after his time at university, I think, and the role that he played, and you sort of hinted at something there, perhaps along the lines of espionage. What was his relationship with the state and working for the state?
So different historians, different scholars say different things. So there's a couple of key pieces of evidence in Marlowe's life relating to his role as spy, informer, intelligencer, courier, slightly unclear. The first is that in his final year at university, doing his MA at Cambridge, the university seems to try to take steps to stop him graduating on the grounds that they think he's planning to go to Reims in France and join the English Catholic seminary there and train as a priest.
Oh, but he was he Catholic?
He wasn't. No. We know about this because the Privy Council, like the cabinet, write to the college and say, no, he wasn't doing that. He never had any intention of doing that, but he was giving important service to Her Majesty. So give this boy his MA.
So he was recruited at Cambridge, like so many great spies.
Well, I mean, exactly a grand tradition, and that's really interesting. It's like that's clearly a big deal. That's clearly a big deal. The government gets involved with granting someone an MA because he's done them service. It's not perhaps quite as big a deal as it sounds. Actually, the Privy Council do quite a lot of like interfering for relatively sort of minor issues. And the chair of the Privy Council happens to be the Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. So like there may be a more kind of obvious reason for them stepping in. Uh-huh. But they do say that he's been engaged on matters touching the benefit of the country, and he's done Her Majesty good service.
So give him a pass.
So he's done something.
Yeah.
He's done something. Whether that means he's gone to Reims undercover to kind of see what's going on among the young men training to be Catholic priests is another matter. And lots of people say that's what he did and that he was a real kind of James Bond type. Nothing in the evidence says that. And he's not, you can't find any evidence of him doing that or being there. And I think that's probably quite unlikely, partly because he's still quite a young man and he's just a student. I mean, like he's sort of not some kind of, Jason Bourne. Like he is just a graduate student. Yeah. They also say really clearly he didn't go there. He may not even have left the country. But what seems perhaps more likely is that he's doing a bit of couriering. He's doing a bit of back and forth. So Marlowe grows up in Canterbury. Canterbury, obviously near the coast, but also has quite a kind of large population of French and Dutch immigrants. He probably speaks French quite well. He certainly has access to French sources later on when he's a playwright. He uses them. So he may just be a useful person. He's a useful person. And it's funny, you made that point about Cambridge and spies. You do see that happening in a way at this time. So Francis Walsingham, who's the Queen's Secretary of State, has his private secretary, a guy called Nicholas Faunt, is a Cambridge graduate. In fact, Faunt also comes from Canterbury, so there may be some connection with Marlowe. Yeah, there is a bit of a kind of old boys university network thing going on.
I think was Francis Bacon the same? Was he at Cambridge?
Yes, he was. He comes from a slightly higher social scale, but his brother, Anthony Bacon, ends up working for Francis Walsingham abroad. And they're very much in a kind of higher level of the sort of political world. So look, it is absolutely likely, in fact, seems to be the case, that Marlowe is doing something
espionage
foreign service, secret service adjacent, points in his MA. He is absent for some of his MA. You can tell that from the records, Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. But actually, lots of people are absent, especially because Cambridge is like really plaguey and malarial. People are always clearing out for weeks at a time. So he is absent. He's probably doing this sort of business. So he's doing something. Now, later on in his career, we've already seen him in Flushing, in what's now called Vlissingen in the Netherlands. He's there for some reason. People don't just go to the Netherlands for nothing at this time. He's there doing something. He's been sent for some reason, foolishly or for whatever reason. He ends up caught up in something silly to do with coin counterfeiting, and it's sent home. So those are the two sort of, I suppose, the two poles around which the story of Marlowe as super spy kind of revolves.
Yeah.
It's not a huge amount, but it's something.
And it's kind of people filling in the gaps that they want to, the way they want to fill in, because it's the exciting story. I mean, like, most espionage is incredibly dull work, and not the James Bond stuff is very rare. But that's quite an interesting question, because it kind of fits in with a lot of stuff about his legacy, I guess, and what you were saying earlier, that there's this sort of compulsion sometimes after authors die, especially when they die in interesting ways, to draw these links between their work and their biography, and to try and find in their biography the stories of their, finding their work actually hidden stories of their biography. And actually, in reality, there can be very little link. Sometimes the most exciting, dangerous writers live very pedestrian lives. I mean, J.G. Ballard just lived in Shepperton his entire life in the same house after an eventful childhood, and yet was writing these extremely graphic, pornographic novels about, car crashes and fucking and stuff. So actually, in response, like after his death, it seems that like there's people wanting to fill in a biography, and those little hints are sort of melded with his work to try and say, well, he must have lived a sort of violent, cavalier life, but there's not really any evidence for that.
Well, that's completely the case with Marlowe. And the work was done really soon after his death. So the work is done to create the figure of the wild man, not a wild man of espionage, a wild man of fights and adultery and fornication and thinking bad thoughts about God. That from the 1597, there are people writing about Marlowe like that. And then many generations later, trying to fashion the exciting espionage Marlowe, you've got the ready-made shape from the Marlovian reputation in the years after his death of the wild boy. So you're just rejigging that mold to shape him as the cool spy.
Yeah, and of course the story of the genius cut short. I mean, I guess what's interesting is at the start of his career, he was more popular, more famous, better regarded than even Shakespeare, and then Shakespeare, after Marlowe's death, really rises into that space of preeminence as a writer.
He does, and that's, Marlowe has been inextricably linked with Shakespeare as a figure. Evidently, they're literarily linked. Their work informs each other, and then obviously Marlowe's work continues to inform Shakespeare. That has also driven all sorts of stories about, did Marlowe write the works of Shakespeare or Shakespeare write the works of Marlowe? And did Marlowe actually die in 1593, or was he, spirited away to France to carry on writing the works of Shakespeare? Like, sort of, the stories get really loopy, kind of the further you get away from sort of kind of plausibility. But it just says something, I think, about the real appeal and power of the glamorous creative figure cut short, the life of the glamorous creative figure cut short.
This is all very interesting, but in terms of badness, I feel like we haven't really touched on any particularly egregious behaviour outside the norms of his time. But in your book, you mentioned a bit his relationship with, or the way he sort of used anti-Semitism and some sort of anti-Islamic scenes in his work. And yeah, I'm curious about whether that was also of his time, not that it justifies it, but if that was something that would have been a recognisable bigotry of his time, or was that something particularly egregious in his work?
Well, I think with Marlowe, I think the times are never sort of fully an excuse for anyone, but also perhaps for Marlowe's excesses. I think he does. I think one of the things that Marlowe does is just sort of is take things in his cultural atmosphere and magnify them. He goes large, and one of the ways he goes large is in taking those societal prejudices and just running wild. So one of his very influential plays is called The Jew of Malta, which is enormously influential on, for example, Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, and really traffics in early modern attitudes to Judaism and anti-Semitism, brings on stage an absolute classic evil Jewish character called Barabbas, who has all of the sort of traits of avaricious, he's violent, he's murderous, he likes poisoning nuns, he's sort of Machiavellian in the kind of most extreme sense. And it's sort of unplayable. You do still see productions of The Jew of Malta, but increasingly rarely, I think probably rightly. And although I think also The Merchant of Venice is a problematic play in lots of ways, has none of the sense of redemption that play offers, or that sense of rounded humanity that play offers of its Jewish characters. Marlowe is just interested in purveying the most kind of extreme form of caricature, and he's doing it for dramatic reasons. That's what he thinks he wants. That's what he thinks the play needs, but he has zero interest in rounding the edge of that caricature in the way that Shakespeare does.
Or offering a contradiction. I mean, in Shakespeare, it's obviously an anti-Semitic representation in its way, but then there's also space within the play that today there can be adaptations of it which introduce contradictions that challenge anti-Semitism. And you're saying that in The Jew of Malta that there is no space built into the character for that change.
You could certainly find a modern production that was able to create that space, but they'd have to do it by
taking liberties
and hacking out that space. Yeah. The play doesn't offer it. The play is presenting a extraordinarily cunning and vicious stage villain who has a certain kind of sort of joie de vivre in his villainy. There is something charismatic about the character, but absolutely not a redeemable human figure in the way that Shylock is.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Well, maybe that's a good point to ask the question we normally end the show with, which is Kit Marlowe, good gay, bad not gay, bad not gay.
I'm going to say good gay.
A good gay. I'm going to
say good gay.
Even despite that.
Despite his peddling of his society's worst prejudices, he is also someone who is exploring his own desires, his own beliefs about himself, the world, through his work in a way that is brave, and it's candid and compelling, and it has survived 400 years.
And when you read it, you read there's the way it interprets and analyzes and addresses queerness. You regard it as something that could only have been written by someone who was queer.
Yeah, Yeah,
I buy that.
That's a subjective view, but I'm going to say yeah.
It's a subjective view, but I buy that. I think that's what you have to do when you're reading queer history a lot of the time, because if something's persecuted, often people don't write it down.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, I could talk about this all day. It's really, really fascinating, and I can 100% heartily recommend the book. I learned so much from it, and it was very clearly laid out as a sort of examination of that time, and it was really and also stuff I just never really thought about. I'd never really thought about Shakespeare at school and what his actual lived life would be outside of watching Shakespeare in Love or something. So it was really interesting to think about him as a historical figure outside of his plays.
Well, if anyone is listening who wants to stump up the money for a queer Shakespeare in Love remake, I'm here for that.
The queer love interest. So if people want to know more about Kit Marlowe, is there any sort of sources you'd recommend?
There's a lot on Marlowe, actually. There's some very good accessible biographies. There's a book called The Reckoning, The Murder of Christopher Marlowe by Charles Nicholl, which goes very long on the espionage and takes, I would say, quite a lot of liberties, but it's an extremely compelling read and lots of fun. There's a slightly more sort of serious-minded biography of Marlowe by a writer called Constance Brown Kuriyama, which is called Christopher Marlowe, A Renaissance Life. And she is much less interested in the espionage, to be honest, much less interested in the queerness as well. She's very good on the documentation, and some very good articles that have sort of pushed back a bit against the sort of sense of Marlowe being a kind of wild man of early modern history.
Well, that's brilliant. Well, that's been our show today. Thank you very much, Dr. Will Tosh, for joining us. My name's Hugh Lemmy. You've been listening to Bad Gays. Until next time, goodbye.
Bad.